Thank you very much. I will spend probably 8 to 10 minutes just to walk through um, the presentation that we prepared, just to share with you the Zambia story. Um, the Zambia story starts in 2021. In 2020, Zambia was the first country to default on its debt post-COVID. And obviously, the issue that led to this were several. Among them, the severe macroeconomic instability. We saw high inflation, volatility of our currency, low foreign reserves. We saw higher expenditure that increased as a share of GDP from about 28% in 2015 to around 37% of GDP by 2021. But even when the expenditure was high, we saw that most of this money was going to debt service because the debt had accumulated so much, and very little was going to priority sectors, education, health, and agriculture as priority sectors that we had set ourselves in Zambia. And at that time, we had agreed that 20% of the budget will go to education, 15% of the budget would go to health, and 10% of the budget will go to agriculture as per the commitments that was made at the African level. And we saw these budgets reducing. Education reduced from 20% in 2015 to around 11% in 2020. Health reduced from 15% in 2015 to around 8% in 2020, and agriculture reduced from 10% in 2015 to around 2% in 2020, and therefore you could see that basically it was making the country worse off. The debt had increased to around 129% in 2021 from around 48% of GDP in 2016. We also saw some policy inconsistencies, and as a result, production started going down. Against that, and with the new government coming in place in 2021, we then embarked on an economic transformation reform. And this economic transformation reform had two broad objectives. One, to restore macroeconomic stability, and the second one, to foster higher, more resilience, and more inclusive growth. Inclusive to make sure that we take the vulnerable on board as we are going with this growth. And the specific objectives were four. The first one was to ensure that we have debt sustainability, and this debt sustainability would be achieved through debt restructuring. The second one was that we have got fiscal sustainability, and this would be achieved through fiscal adjustment. The third one is that as we are taking these reforms and undertaking these adjustments, that we needed to take care of the vulnerable, the poor, by ensuring that we increase social spending to protect the vulnerable and the poor. And the third one, the fourth one was to strengthen our governance and reduce the risk of corruption. And obviously, when I appeared before a budget committee, the question was, did we achieve these objectives? And we did achieve these objectives, and this is why we are now looking at going to the next reform agenda. The program, the economic transformation program that we set ourselves was anchored on the 8th National Development Plan. And in the 8th National Development Plan, we identified 4 sectors as the priority sector that we are going to concentrate on. And these sectors were agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and tourism. And then we identified to say, what are the enablers of these sectors? One was energy, because we set ourselves a target of 3 million metric tons of copper production over a period of 10 years. Then we needed to ensure that we increase our energy production. Two is transport and logistics. For us to be able to undertake to transport these minerals that we are producing, we needed to have transport and logistics. And just yesterday, the colleagues were talking about the Lobito corridor as one of the strategies that we have put in the transport and logistics. The third one is technology. And again, we are talking about technology and how it can help us there. Then we had the water infrastructure and obviously the skills development. And against this economic transformation, then we say what would be the strategic supporting development areas that would be able to give us that. Human and social development to ensure that we can be able to respond to that challenge. Obviously, the 8th Secretary General of the UN yesterday was talking about the issue of globalization and climate change, and we took that as an area that we should be able to concentrate on, and governance and as one of the areas. And if I were just to give you an example of the governance area, in the governance area, we actually had corruption measured as on the perception index, improving from about 33 in 2021 to around 39 in 2025, and we believe that we'll continue improving on that. And then, obviously, then the question was, if we're undertaking this economic transformation reforms, what are these reforms that we are going to undertake? On the economic front, we talked about fiscal consolidation, and in the fiscal consolidation, we talked about expenditure rationalization, enhancing domestic resource mobilization, and limiting external borrowing, and only external borrowing gotten on concessional terms. What this meant was that if our domestic resource mobilization is, say, 25% of GDP, and we are having an expenditure of 37%, what that means is that the difference should come either as a loan or as a grant from cooperating partners. But once we rationalize and we reduce from 37% and we bring it, say, to 28%, and our domestic resources is 25, it means that our borrowing then reduces to the difference of that. That is basically what it means. And therefore, we needed to look at both sides. On the revenue side, how do we increase? On the expenditure side, how do we rationalize and make sure that we prioritize? We then had to ensure that in order to bring everyone on board in an inclusive growth model, how do we therefore have rationalized and well-targeted subsidies that are going to be able to have impact? And we had the social cash transfer, we had the free education, we had the health reforms, we have the Consumers Development Fund, where now we are talking about taking money to the local or to areas through the Consumers Development Fund model, while we are looking at devolution as the outlet that we are going to embark on, so that the local authorities are the one that will be able to be in charge on this. We then found a lot of challenges. Zambia is dependent on the mining sector. And the question was, what do we do in the mining so that it can continue anchoring as we are looking at the diversification? We had some companies that were just about to pull out. We had two big mining companies, Kokola Copper Mine and Mopani Copper Mine, that had stopped mining, and some Kokola Copper Mine was in court, and Mopani Copper Mine was actually abandoned. And we engaged with the investors, and as we speak now, both Konkola Copper Mine and Mopani Copper Mine is on board, and our copper production has started increasing. We are targeting to reach 3 million tons in the next 10 years. We now are around 933,000 metric tons. This is the first time we have reached those levels. We have always produced around 750,000 metric tons, and we believe that in 2026, we'll be able to reach 1 million metric tons, and we'll be on course to go towards our 3 million metric tons. Obviously, we then embarked on the debt restructuring under the G20 Common Framework. And the G20 Common Framework then says, okay, you go and have this debt restructuring, but it should be anchored on an IMF reform program. And the IMF reform program basically was to give some surety to the creditors that are coming on the table that Zambia will be doing the right thing. It was easier for us because that IMF reform program was predicated on the 8th National Development Plan. So we went to the IMF and we told us, this is our plan, this is how we want to implement it, and the IMF then agreed and said the plan is good and we are going to support it. So implementation was not difficult because this is a homegrown program that was being supported by the IMF. What are some of the reforms that we committed to undertake? One are the debt reforms, the legal framework where we now have provided oversight by Parliament to see what the executive are doing, where now we are talking about having a debt management office, modern debt management office, front office, middle and back office that will be able to make sure that we have got good construction and management systems in place. We then talked about amending the law that now makes it mandatory for us to be able to go to Parliament on a quarterly basis to tell the Zambian people and the stakeholders what exactly we are borrowing, for what we are borrowing, and what are the terms on which we are borrowing. We then had also other reforms that I already talked about. In the agriculture, we had direct input support where government was buying inputs and giving to deserving farmers. We then moved from there. We had proper targeting, and we came with what we call the e-voucher system, where we identified the needs and gave the money, a card to the farmer, and the farmer was free to go and get whatever input that they needed to get in order to be able. And then we also made sure that we cleaned up this system. The first year of doing this system, we had 1 million farmers on the system, and 280,000 of them we found they were ghost farmers. They were not existent, but they were getting this, and we believe that we are going in the right direction. And because of this support we are giving, in 2025, we had the highest maize production, 90% of which came from the small-scale farmers, most of them that we are supporting on this FISIP. And we had that biggest bumper harvest. In 2026, with the rains that we have, we believe that we are even going to have the higher production than we had in 2025. And now we then look at what have we achieved during this period that we have taken these reforms. 2.1% average growth in GDP over the previous 5 years compared to 5.2% average growth. When you look at the inflation, we saw that inflation was going up, and now it is coming back to the single digit, to the band of 6 to 8%, which is our target inflation. And we saw that in the first quarter of 2026, we'll be able to achieve that, and we believe that will be sustainable on that level. On the right side, you see the graph on international reserves. At the time in 2021, if you look at July 2021, our international reserves were about 1.4 billion, or just under 2 months of import cover. We have now increased our reserves to about 5.5 billion, and we are at about 4.8 months of import cover. When you look at our exchange rate, we had exchange rate that was broadly on depreciation since 2021. However, we have seen that exchange rate now has stabilized, and in the last month, in January, it became strong, and other people or other media houses were reporting it as the strongest performing currency, and we have seen that we are achieving that. This basically is showing about the budget discipline that we have introduced, and here we are just comparing what was the fiscal deficit or the debt financing of the budget compared to the economic growth. And when I was doing economic development at my college, my professor said that sometimes correlation does not mean causality, but when we see in this graph, we see a lot of correlation, and one would say probably one causes the other, and where we see that when we are borrowing more, our growth was low. When we reduce our borrowing to finance the budget, our growth is going high. There are other countries now that have even introduced fiscal rules. Indonesia is one of them, where they have introduced fiscal rules. By rule of the thumb, we are told that when a poor country borrows more than 3% of GDP to finance the budget, that country will have challenges in servicing that debt. And our fiscal policy now is that our budget deficit should not be more than 3% of GDP. And this is what we are doing. This is the question that was asked. How are we making sure that we cushion ourselves to a debt default again? On the left slide, we are basically showing what is our domestic revenues as a share of GDP. And on the right side, we are showing ourselves what is our domestic revenues as a share of the budget. In 2021, 59% was the domestic revenues. It means that the rest of the money was borrowed or it was through grants. By 2025, we reached 81. In 2026, we are saying that the budget will be financed, 82% of the budget will be financed by the domestic revenues, and we are projecting that to go to 87% in the medium term. The next graph is basically showing on our debt restructuring and sustainability. Remember, I showed you the graph that was dipping in terms of what we are borrowing, and obviously, with the debt restructuring, our debt now, that was raising up to 1.9% of GDP, is now reducing, and in 2025, December, this debt was at 94% of GDP, and therefore we are creating fiscal space and reducing the borrowing. I'm just remaining with one slide, if you allow me. This is the slide that basically I was talking about on the credit rating, and it shows. And now the question is, where do we want to go? And these are the macroeconomic objectives we have. Our growth in 2026, we project it at 6.4%. Inflation, we think, will be within the band, and that we have our domestic resource mobilization effort continuing. And this graph is basically showing where Zambia is being positioned in the medium term from 2026 to 2028 compared to Sub-Saharan Africa country. And you see that our performance in terms of economic growth on average is higher than the Sub-Saharan Africa country. And the last table that I had was basically what is it in the debt restructuring. Where are we now? We have finished our program with the IMF, successfully completed all the 6 reviews. We now are going into the new program with the IMF. The mission team of the IMF will be arriving in Zambia tomorrow for us to start looking at the scoping mission of what the new program should look like. And our view is that we'll continue on sustaining macroeconomic, preserving fiscal discipline, but now talking about creating conducive environment for private sector investment and job creation. Let me end here and say thank you very much, it's a pleasure once again to be with you and to present the Zambian story to all of you. Thank you.